Welcome back to the Football by Nico show. We are here today with John Vogel, owner of Football Sapient, NFL draft analyst. John, how you doing?
Pretty good, man. Good to have good thanks for inviting me. It's really good to be here.
Of course. And today, what we're going to do is we're just going to go over some of the crazy trades that have happened this past offseason, maybe why teams are more inclined to do so, and just go look at overall roster building. So let's just
That's
start
that's what
off
I'm good at.
with
So
one of the biggest trades this past offseason, the Russell Wilson trade. Denver traded for Russell Wilson and a 2022 round 4 draft pick and traded to Seattle Drew Lock, Shelby Harris, Noah Fant, a round 1, 2, and 5 pick in the 2022 draft, and a round 1 and 2 pick in the 2023 draft. What are some of your immediate thoughts on that?
when it happened, it made a lot of sense because if you looked at where Denver was last year in terms of their roster, they were really a quarterback away from being competitive, and they kind of had that battle all year between Drew Lock and Teddy Bridgewater, and it was subpar the entire year. But you have a great core. You've got a pretty solid defense. The receivers were really set last year. Between Jerry Jeudy having a good breakout the way that he did, and then Cortland Sutton, and there's a ton of young talent on that team as well. And so they felt like they needed a quarterback, a guy that could come in and kind of change it. And that's Russell. Russell is an ungodly talent in terms of what he brings. And the only reason he was a third round pick back in, 2012 when he came out, he had a great senior bowl and he did all kinds of he had great tape, played really well at both Wisconsin and North Carolina State. But that was the thing with him was his size. And if you look at the last couple of years in Seattle, it seemed like there was a lot of back and forth banter where they didn't agree with a lot of what they wanted to do between him and Pete Carroll. Like they were friends, they got along and everything, but on the field, Russell's not quite what Pete Carroll prefers in a quarterback. But in Denver, that shouldn't play any factor. They've got Nate Hackett there now too, who's worked with Aaron Rodgers and is kind of familiar with this type of quarterback. A guy that can kind of run when he has to, but has a really good arm, can push the ball down the field. So it made a lot of sense. It's their quarterback that they need.
Yeah, I think kind of like piggybacking off what you were saying, lots of people were saying, Aaron Rodgers to Denver, any other quarterback to Denver. So it made sense just, because they were kind of a quarterback away. And in terms of the picks, I think, they traded basically 3 first round picks, if you include Noah Fant, who was a former first round pick, and then a solid depth player in Shelby Harris. And obviously they had to swap a quarterback, Drew Lock, to Seattle. So I think that, they are obviously starting a mini rebuild. I don't think they're fully blowing it up just yet. And I could possibly see, maybe some of those other veterans from that roster be traded as well, including Bobby Wagner, who, was released. So I think Seattle's
Yeah.
starting to try and, be starting a new regime.
Wagner was a little bit more of a cap hit, I want to say. They wanted to kind of free up some of that money, especially in the future, because was it 1 or 2 years left? I think it was 2 years that he had left on his deal, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that, just the fact that he was such a big presence in their locker room, same draft class as Russell Wilson,
Yeah.
just kind of signifies that, it's coming to an end in Seattle of some sorts.
Just not, I don't even think it's just that too with Seattle, because I mean, in terms of, compensation, what they got back, um, it kind of worked out. You got back a quarterback who needs a fresh start. So if Drew Lock ends up becoming, the starting quarterback there, that's still to be determined. You have Jacob Eason over there and Geno Smith. And now, like that's not quite settled. That's going to be running this entire offseason and training camp as they try to figure out who's going to start there. But if Drew Lock, let's say fresh start really works out for him, and you got a couple extra first round picks, including, one that you gave up to get Jamal Adams a couple years ago, you get that one back this year too, because that's essentially what happened. It's not a terrible trade. And like you said, you mentioned Shelby Harris, who's probably going to start on that defense. They want to go to a rotational front, and Harris is perfect for that. And then Noah Fant too gives them at least a tight end that they can kind of work with. It's a good run blocker and is a capable receiver. So I'm not exactly seeing this idea where everyone is kind of saying like, oh, they're about to blow it up and blow this and that. And I understand the points with Russell moving on and Bobby Wagner letting him go. But this is still, a competitive team right now in the NFC. I'm not saying they're going to go run in the NFC West and, go win the division and beat the Rams out, or the 49ers for that matter, and the Cardinals are going to be a challenge too. But I mean, overall, looking at the NFC right now, you don't need a great quarterback to win games there. You know what I'm saying? Because when you look at like the top 10 quarterbacks in the league, there's maybe 3 that you can name in the NFC right now, and that being, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Matthew Stafford. If you really wanted to push your luck, you could make an argument and say Dak Prescott, but everybody else is in the AFC. So do you really need this great quarterback to make a deep playoff run, or are you going to take your draft capital, which, they got 2 starting tackles in the draft this year? Is that necessarily a rebuild, And I think they're not quite approaching it like a rebuild like we're thinking they are. I think they're looking at it as it's a change of scenery, and we're taking advantage of this upcoming quarterback class where there's potentially 4 or 5 starting quarterbacks coming out. And if we need one, we can take one. If we don't, if we have our guy, we're still a competitive team.
Yeah, I agree with some of the points you said there. It's more of like a reload rather than a rebuild. Trading away Russell Wilson got him a lot of those young players back. Noah Fant and Drew Lock. And I think that to be competitive in the NFC West, they're going to have a little bit better quarterback room than they have right now, for sure.
Yeah, I think winning 2 games in the division is going to be a big thing for them. I don't think you're going to beat the Rams. There's too much, bad blood there right now. In terms of the Rams are just, they're looking to repeat. And they got Bobby Wagner, and he's going to play lights out. And their defense is already stacked. So I think the goal is to beat Arizona once and beat San Francisco once, preferably at home. But it's the rest of the schedule where you're kind of thinking that you could make a run at 500, maybe sneak in as a 7 seed if Arizona kind of falls off or whatever, and make that run, make that playoff run. It's just, if the goal is to win 2, it's going to be great if you can win 3, but I think 2 is probably the most realistic.
Yeah. And then now just moving on to the next trade, you got Carson Wentz to the Commanders. The Commanders got Carson Wentz, a 2022 round 2 pick, which turns into Fedarian Mathis, and a round 7 pick, which turns into Christian Holmes. And then Indianapolis got Jelani Woods, Andrew Booth, and a 2022 round 3 pick. Personally, I think, that it was needed for both sides to have a fresh start. I know there was a report that came out a couple of weeks ago that Chris Ballard said even if Matt Ryan wasn't available, they were still going to move on from Carson in some sort. What do you think about that?
No, I think it's kind of the mantra that surrounded Carson over the last few years, and it really goes back to when the Eagles win the Super Bowl with Nick Foles coming in relief. And there's a lot of stories from that time period where Carson didn't handle it well. And that's a hard thing to handle, where you are about to probably be the NFL MVP. You go down in week 14, 15, whatever it was, against the Rams with a torn ACL, you're done for the year. And the guy that's sitting behind you takes them the rest of the way. And so apparently he was saying stuff in the locker rooms that people didn't like, and just kind of being not a great teammate, which, I'm not saying that that's an easy situation to be a great teammate, but that was kind of the issue. And that's why Philadelphia felt like they had to move, and they have a guy like Jalen Hurts, right, last year, who played pretty well. Everybody knows that I love Jalen, and I'll bring him up every chance I get, and to go ahead and plug him because I really think that he's going to be a good quarterback. But that was the other thing too, was Jalen was a more stable locker room presence than Carson. And that's why they took all that dead cap money and they just ate it and they moved him to Indianapolis. And Indianapolis didn't get their money's worth. And they felt like, yeah, he's got to go, because I think there were probably some locker room issues going on there too, especially in the last couple of weeks of the season. You can't go out on week 18 and lose to the Jacksonville Jaguars. when you have the playoffs in your grasp. All they had to do was win the game. They're in the playoffs, and it was a terrible performance by everyone on that team, not just Carson, but everyone. So they felt like they had to move him because they don't want that kind of, a presence there. And I think there were some issues too because Carson's not vaccinated. And think what you want about, that whole political side of it. The NFL looked at it as, and the Colts looked at it as, we don't have him, for a couple of weeks of the season where we potentially could have won another game and not been in that situation. So it also speaks volumes to how desperate Washington is right now to get a suitable quarterback because they're a quarterback away from being a very competitive team in the NFC East.
Yeah, I think definitely he's the best quarterback I think Washington has had in a couple years.
Mm-hmm.
And even just looking at his stats from last year, he wasn't a bad quarterback. I think it was something like 25 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. That's a pretty average quarterback stat. But you look at some of his performances last year, like you said against the Jags, and some of his throws were really questionable. I know personally when I watched this game against the Rams where he injured both of his ankles on that same play, it was just pretty interesting to see because I don't know how he does it, but he's
Pat McAfee getting on his show. This man, not just one ankle, but two ankles. I love Pat McAfee.
Yeah. I think that he's definitely carried that tag around him, of injury riddled for the past couple years. And it'll be interesting to see if he can, play a full season in Washington because he just hasn't been able to, I don't think, in a while.
No, he hasn't. And that's unfortunate, because he missed the couple games with the ankle injuries, and then he missed games because he was tested positive for COVID. So those are games that in the long run, when you look at the overall season, those were games they could have won. And they're in the playoffs last year. And so I guess you want your guy, your quarterback, to be around. That's the most valuable part of being a quarterback is you can play at any point and you're always available. Think Tom Brady. Tom Brady's missed one season and maybe a game or two over 21 years, or 22 years, however long it's been now. Aaron Rodgers doesn't miss a lot of games. Russell Wilson doesn't miss a lot of games. So availability is your biggest thing with a quarterback, and the more that you're not available, the more that's going to hurt you.
Yeah, definitely. And now we're moving on to Cleveland and Dallas, the Amari Cooper trade. Cleveland got Amari Cooper, a 2022 round 6 pick, turned into wide receiver Michael Woods out of Oklahoma. And Dallas got a round 5 pick and round 6 pick. What do you think about Amari going to Cleveland?
Amari was a cap hit. Like Dallas has so many big contracts on that roster, and the salary cap rebounded nicely this year, right? Which, because it dropped, I think it was 10 million last year due to the COVID and the loss of revenue from that. And it jumped back up 30 this year, or I think it was 30, right? It was 30 or 20. And you're going to continue to see that 20 million, 15 million jump range each year. But that's why these big contracts come in and they're backloaded. But that being said, they didn't have room for him. They just didn't. And if there was a receiver that they felt like that they could move, that they were comfortable to move, it was Amari. Do I necessarily agree with that? Not really. Because I think I would have moved Cedric Wilson and probably tried to see if Amari would convert some of that salary into a signing bonus and try to get that off the books. But for Cleveland, it worked out great because, you just had a quarterback that was hurt last year that, kind of ran your 2-star wide receivers out of Cleveland, and you needed to reload that. And there's good players that are on that team right now too. Donovan Peoples-Jones really surprised a lot of people, myself included. Anthony Schwartz looked really good at times, and he's a freaking burner is what he is. So you needed a reliable guy, and Amari, for the most part, you don't think of Amari Cooper and think drops. He's been a pretty reliable receiver pretty much everywhere, whether it was, with the Raiders or with the Cowboys. So it made sense. It was a good move for the Browns, a much better move for the Browns than it was the Cowboys, who were just trying to move him and get something back so that they didn't have to cut him and eat that $20 million.
Yeah. I think, like you said, he was probably debatably the best wide receiver on the Cowboys. I know CD is definitely one of their fan favorites, but I think that, him as a wide receiver, there was a reason that they traded, first round capital for him a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the fact that the Cleveland was able to trade such a sixth round and fifth and sixth round pick for him was pretty great for them. And, pairing him with Deshaun Watson now should be interesting to see.
It's going to be a really interesting situation in Cleveland, too, because you got Kareem Hunt coming back this year as well. He missed a lot of games last year. And Kareem Hunt isn't just a good running back, but he's capable, much more capable than Nick Chubb is as a receiver. And when you have that threat coming out of the backfield, like a solid threat, like an Alvin Kamara, like, a Kareem Hunt, it makes a difference on the passing game, and it really opens up a lot of opportunities for guys like Amari, guys like Donovan Peoples-Jones. So it's gonna work out for Cleveland. They're gonna be fine.
Yeah, and then speaking of Cleveland, the next trade we got is Chase Winovich for Mac Wilson, New England and Cleveland. Chase Winovich, obviously D end, I believe 2019 draft for another D end and Mac Wilson. How do you feel about those guys?
Winovich is one of those high upside guys, right? When he was picked, where he wasn't quite a finished product, but you liked what you saw on the tape. He had some really good tools. He's a pretty good athlete. You want to see him refine some of that stuff, and he hasn't taken the steps that you hoped he would as a player. Now, that's not to say that he's not going to get there. A change of scenery could very well do that, but it is also worth noting that just about everyone that Bill Belichick has sent to the Cleveland Browns in a trade has not worked out for the Cleveland Browns. So I'm not saying that Chase Winovich is a done player and, he's not going to work out in Cleveland. I think it could potentially be a really good move for Cleveland to give them some depth on that defensive line. They've got a lot of guys they can kind of rotate. And I think Winovich is probably going to end up in a role where he'll play 40 snaps a game. But it is worth noting that, Jamie Collins was traded to Cleveland. It's almost like a death sentence from Bill Belichick when he trades you to Cleveland. It's like, oh, okay, you don't like it here. You don't like our organized structure. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to send you to the worst franchise in the NFL. And it's kind of, it's that mark that it kind of leaves. So I thought overall the Browns needed to do it, so it made sense. They needed another guy there, especially if Jadeveon Clowney doesn't come back this year. That's kind of the question mark. And I think on my podcast a couple days ago, I had the same guy that you did from our website, Dan Toomey, and we were talking about this, and he was saying, I think that Jadeveon is waiting for the Deshaun Watson suspension to come down before he decides if he's going to stay in Cleveland or not.
Yeah, and just those guys, same draft class. Mac Wilson went 155, and Chase Winovich went 77th.
Yeah.
So just looking at that, you don't see many player-for-player trades that often, and that's what we have on the next trade. We have Yannick Ngakoue for Rock Ya-Sin. I know Yannick Ngakoue has been on, I think, like 4-ish teams the past couple of years, from the Raiders. He was on the Ravens. He was on the Vikings. And now he gets to join the Colts defensive line. What do you think about that?
So, made sense. The Colts needed him. If you look at their roster right now, they really only had one real edge rusher, and that was Kwity Paye. And the jury, I guess, is still kind of out on him, their first-round pick from last year. And you didn't have a high draft pick this year where you could go and just go get another guy, right, that was going to be an impact. So, Ngakoue, his issue, I think, is consistency, right? Because he's had one season where he's been really consistent. Think like a player comp with a very similar career structure is Vic Beasley. Where Beasley pops out on the scene in 2016, you think you have this stud edge rusher, and doesn't turn out that way. Ngakoue is a needed presence just because that defensive line needed another pass rusher. If you're going to run a 4-man front.
Yeah. I think that, like you said, the only other defensive lineman I can think of off the top of my head of the Colts is DeForest Buckner. they didn't exactly have, the best defensive line. They ranked almost in the bottom half of the league in terms of team sacks, right near the Jets and the Jaguars. So that just goes to show you, what you don't want to be in terms of like stat wise.
Yeah,
I
and the
think
other
that he
thing
was.
about Yannick too is he's a good run defender. That's one of the underrated things about his game that people don't talk a lot about is he's a good run defender. And you're in a conference, a division right now with Derrick Henry, you know, who's going to run the ball 30 times, and you've got to have a defensive front that's going to stop him 30 times and not let him get going the entire game. And I think Yannick definitely helps out with that a lot. I didn't mean to interrupt you. That thought popped in my head.
No, it's all good. And then moving to the next one, this is one of my personal favorite moves of the offseason. You got Khalil Mack to the Chargers from the Bears. The Chargers got Khalil Mack, and then the Bears got a second-round pick, turned into Jaquan Brisker, and a 2023 round 6th pick. Obviously, the Chargers ate most of his salary, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that he can add to a defense that was already pretty good last year. What do you think about Khalil Mack?
It's terrifying because you have Joey Bosa on that defense already, and now you get to put Khalil Mack. I can't wait to see what they're going to do with, because I've been on the record many times talking about what I love about Brandon Staley and the defensive things that he comes up with. Because back, I think it was 2 years ago, might be almost 3 now, when I was helping out at the Rambling Fan and covering the Rams, and I talked about their secondary and what Staley was doing as their defensive coordinator there with that was quite revolutionary. Like, it wasn't something that we'd seen with disguised coverages and having a versatile enough secondary where you could send players all over the place and different assignments from different places. And it was awesome. It was a lot of fun to watch. So with this, it's not the secondary, but it's the front. And it really makes you wonder what he's going to start running with these two on either side. And you've got a really decent interior guy too, because Jerry Tillery's a pretty decent guy. I think Austin Johnson is we don't talk about him a lot because he's a 3-4 defensive end, and you just don't talk about 3-4 defensive ends unless they're JJ Watt. But Bosa and Khalil Mack is going to be so much fun, and I can't wait to see what he's going to do with those two.
Yeah, definitely. They made a lot of good defensive acquisitions. They signed J.C. Jackson in free agency. Obviously, you got Sebastian Joseph Day from the Rams. I think that you're just trying to build, a good defense on the opposite side of Justin Herbert and, capitalize off of his rookie contract.
Oh, 100%. That's exactly what you're trying to do right now, because you're going to have to pay Herbert top money. If Herbert goes out there, if the Chargers win the division, which is going to be a handful, Kansas City might be a little bit down this year. I wouldn't say that because it's Andy Reid, and we've seen what the guy can do. But you have a year right now where you can kind of grab that division. Denver's going to push for it, so they're going to be more competitive. Las Vegas is not a terrible team either. But this is kind of that year where it's up for grabs. If Herbert wins this division and they make let's say they make a Super Bowl run, you're going to have to give Herbert probably Patrick Mahomes type money. And that's coming up in 2 years. So you have to capitalize on this rookie contract like right now before you get yourself into that spot where you're having to pay him $50 million a year.
Yeah, definitely. I think that like what you said, if he can compete in that tough of a division, he definitely deserves that kind of money. And just looking at the rest of the defense, some of the new acquisitions they have, like we already said, Sebastian Joseph Day, you have Khalil Mack, J.C. Jackson, Otito Ogbonya, who I liked a lot from UCLA. Compared him to Fletcher Cox, just a big run stuffer, which they need. Morgan Fox, who has a relationship with Brandon Staley and Sebastian Joseph Day, so not too surprised about that one. Same thing with Troy Reeder, also from the Rams. Then you had Kyle Van Noy. I was really surprised about that one. And I was actually listening to him on the Pat McAfee show a couple of weeks ago. And he was just saying how he wanted to come in there and create a championship kind of culture. I think that'll be great for the Chargers, just having a veteran presence like him.
And it's not even just him; it's Khalil too. Khalil's a veteran presence. You know, Joey Bosa's been around for a while now too. You know, he's finally getting it down. If he can stay healthy and play a full season, like that's going to be a killer. And then Derwin James, of course, that back end. You want to talk about a great strong safety, somebody who can move around and play a lot of different stuff. They look awesome. And honestly, too, like they drafted JT Woods, who was a kid I really liked out of Baylor. Um, he wasn't talked a lot about during the pre-draft process and everything. He popped in the third round, and I was like, that's about right. He's potentially a guy that can step up a lot like Jordan Fuller did with the Rams a couple of years ago in his rookie year. Like that's the type of player that he is. He's very versatile. So they have a lot of capital, a lot of talent that they can move around this entire team and do a lot of different things with. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. And I think just adding on to that, you also have some of those guys on the rotation for the defensive line, similar to what Brandon Staley did with the Rams. I'm sure they're going to have a good rotation, which will help keep, their stars fresh. Aaron Donald doesn't play all the snaps, and that's why he's able just to come in and be a game wrecker. And I think that they're going to try and do that with the Chargers next year as well.
They have the depth to do it. They can do literally whatever they want with this depth. If I'm in the defensive coordinator and I am charged with putting a defense together, I am gonna have to probably be held back from making my playbook 600 pages, because like, oh, I can do this, oh, I can do that. We can do so many different things, you know.
Yeah. And then moving on to our next trade, we have Shaq Mason from New England to Tampa Bay, reunites him with his former QB and Tom Brady. After Tampa Bay did lose a little bit off their offensive line last year. What do you think about Shaq Mason?
Well, look at what knocked the Buccaneers out of the playoffs when they played the Rams. What was the issue? You had no offensive line depth, and Brady was uncomfortable, which is not something that we're used to seeing. Like that guy normally handles pressure really well, but when you have Aaron Donald crashing through your right guard and basically almost like you might as well not have a right guard, and Tristan Wirfs is out there trying to play through an injury and he's not playing well, that whole right side was just destroyed and demolished. It didn't matter if it was Donald, didn't matter if it was Leonard Floyd. So you knew you had to shore that up. You knew you had to get some depth right there. But Mason's a great starting right guard. He's familiar. He's played with Brady before. It made all the sense in the world. It really did. And I was surprised that New England was as willing to move on from him, especially after losing Joe Thuney as well. Like that was the surprise to me. But I think they feel very comfortable with Cole Strange, who they got in the first round. And the Patriots aren't overly worried about it.
Yeah. I think that, like you said, when you want to beat Brady, you want to make him uncomfortable. That's why the Rams were able to take advantage of that offensive line weakness and just kind of make him uncomfortable in that pocket. And adding Shaq Mason gives him that kind of depth, gives him, familiarity with Brady. I think it'll be good for them next year. Mm-hmm. And now moving on to a really surprising one, personally for me, you have the Davante Adams trade to the Las Vegas Raiders. The Packers got back a 2022 round 1 pick, which turned into Quay Walker, and a round 2 pick traded to Indianapolis. First of all, I was not expecting Davante Adams to be traded. I know they franchise tagged him, I believe, but just the whole situation in Green Bay was just a mess between him and Aaron Rodgers. Apparently, there were reports of them offering him same contract, similar to what the Raiders were going to pay him, but he just wanted out. I was really surprised about that. What about you?
No, I wasn't surprised. And it's kind of a common thing with contracts, especially with star players like Davante, who is arguably, it might not even be arguably, it might kind of be consensual at this point, the number 1 receiver in the league. Like he's a game changer, and he's been awesome with Aaron Rodgers. And there's an old saying with a lot of agents and stuff. You'll hear this a lot when you're around a lot of agents. They'll talk about like this. They'll say, if you really want a guy, you're going to pay him early on. And that's what they've kind of done with Devontae is they beat around the bush, and then now Rodgers gets a crazy contract extension, and you still haven't touched Devontae, and you still have other guys that you're going to be coming up and paying for here in the near future. Devontae he was done with the whole situation and wanted out for that reason. And they told him, he told them immediately, he says, I'm not going to play under the tag. So as soon as he didn't show up for that first voluntary workout, they're like, yeah, we got to move him. He's gone, For the Raiders, it made sense because you're pairing him with his college quarterback, Derek Carr. They played together and were very good together. So you've seen this trend recently where receivers pair with their college quarterbacks, especially when they were very, very good together. Chase to Joe, Jalen Waddle to Tua. These are guys that had a lot of chemistry together, and they've just continued it at the next level. So for the Raiders, that was a no-brainer. We're in a crazy loaded conference right now. We're trying to stay relevant, and we have a lot of really good players across the board, but why not bring that familiarity to our offense between Carr and Devontae? And it made sense. So I liked that, but the Packers just screwed themselves is what happened. They should have paid him if they really, really wanted him a long time ago.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Obviously he's one of the best, if not the best wide receiver in the league. But when you look at just their situations, I can't understand, him wanting to go from a Hall of Fame quarterback in Aaron Rodgers to like a slightly above average quarterback in Derek Carr. He's not going to get, the many, many targets a game like he did in Green Bay. Obviously, you got Darren Waller over there. You got Hunter Renfrow. So in terms of like fantasy football and like that kind of stuff, I don't know if I would draft him at the same level as I would before. But just looking at how he wanted to be treated as a player, obviously he's going to take the route to get more money.
I wouldn't say all of that. I think the reason that we saw Hunter get all the targets the way he did last year is, number one, John Gruden, as the head coach there, was very far behind the NFL. And it's a common occurrence with coaches when they've been out at the NFL for a while and they haven't worked. And for him, yeah, he was watching it every week, but he wasn't putting game plans together. He was putting his Monday Night Football broadcast together. And from the moment that he stepped back into the league, he was behind. And you saw this with the personnel that they would target in the upper rounds of the draft, right? And the way that they would run these schemes and different things. Now, when Gruden left the NFL, who was a very, very big receiver that was getting a ton of targets and was being schemed extremely well, was wrecking the league? Wes Welker. And who does Hunter Renfrow kind of play like and have similar size? And, well, I guess he's a good bit bigger, but similar skill sets and traits? Wes Welker. So I think Renfrow cashed in on an opportunity where he was just being schemed really well. And once they lost Ruggs, who was the other receiver on that team? You're going to try to tell me Bryan Edwards was ready to be a number one receiver? So I think Devontae will be fine with his production and with his fantasy value. And again, too, the familiarity. I can't stress that enough. Those two, when you go put on their college tape together, you have to go way back. It's 2013 was the last time they played together. It is awesome tape. It looks like Aaron Rodgers throwing to him. And that's why Derek Carr went where he did, where he was out of Fresno State, which does not historically produce a lot of great quarterbacks. But he was out of Fresno State, and he was playing very well. So was Carr, that's the other question about Carr too, or do we look at him as an above average quarterback or slightly above average quarterback because of the schemes that he's been asked to play in? Or is he better? We just haven't seen it yet because everybody that plays with this guy loves this guy.
Yeah, I think that we'll definitely see that this next year for sure. And he has all the weapons he needs to succeed. You got Josh Jacobs in the backfield, you got Hunter Renfrow, Darren Waller, now the best wide receiver in the league. I mean, how much more of a team can you want around you?
Yeah.
And
so the issue with Josh Jacobs is that they just declined his 5th-year option. which means he's probably going to be a free agent next year. So they don't feel the same way that you do about Josh Jacobs. But just worth noting. And they went out and they got a lot of guys this year to kind of stock up to prepare for him to go, with between drafting Zamir White out of Georgia and then picking up Britton Brown and Sincere McCormick. Like, they're loading up. They're getting ready for him to be gone.
Yeah. And then now just moving on to another one, we have Deshaun Watson from Houston to Cleveland. Cleveland got Deshaun Watson and a 2024 round 6 pick. Houston got a 2022 round 1, 2022 round 4, 2023 round 1 and 3, 2024 round 1 and 4. What do you think about that compensation compared to some of the other ones we've been talking about so far?
It's very gracious considering everything that's around Deshaun Watson right now. But I think what it kind of signifies is Cleveland feels like Deshaun Watson is a top 10 quarterback in the league. And last time he was on the field, I think that's fair to say. He was a top 10 quarterback in the league, right there at the fringe around 8, 9, 10. Now he's been sitting a year. We don't know what he's going to look like. Now he may come out and start throwing 450 and 4 touchdowns or whatever, but you have that suspension coming up and you don't know you're going to assume he stayed healthy and in shape and everything, but you're really not in football shape unless you're playing football, and he hasn't been. So it makes sense, why they structured the contract the way that they did, where it was very low this first year and then it jumps up the next few years because you're kind of anticipating he's going to have to get back in football shape. So the first year you're not going to expect a lot from. But now down the road, you're making the bet that Deshaun Watson is going to get through all these civil cases just fine. He was innocent, whatever. They believe he's innocent. That's what they say. And he's going to be your long-term guy. So it's a little risky for me just because, I've been covering this Watson story since it broke. Not a lot of people can say that. Not a lot of people were covering it initially, and it took a couple weeks before everybody else started to catch on to it. And I've been reading all the complaints and everything, and I'm not sold yet on the fact that he's going to be walking scot-free once he gets through 23 civil cases. So, but the Browns feel like he's good. It's a risky bet. You're betting on him getting through all the court legal action just fine.
Yeah. And then something I was talking about with Dan on the podcast for the first episode, we were just saying how obviously they don't have that much confidence in him as well, because you have Baker Mayfield still on the roster, you have Jacoby Brissett still on the roster, and those are guys that can start and win games for you. So obviously they're not 100% sold that he's even going to play next year.
I think the Baker issue, they would have moved Baker if they could have, and Baker kind of screwed himself over. Because he has this mantra that surrounds him right now, and it looks like it's actually probably true, but just the fact that he's not mature, he's not an adult yet, and that's not good when you're 25, 26 like he is. He's been already caught cheating on his wife. He goes on a podcast and he's like, "Hey, it's not my fault." When you're a leader of a team, you have to take responsibility at some point. And that's kind of the issue with Baker, is that he's never taken responsibility when things go wrong. He'll take it every day when things go right. Like, hey, look, we're in the playoffs. Look at me, blah, blah, blah. But as soon as it goes wrong, it's not my fault. I had, 4 different coaches in 5, whatever he said, 5 coaches in 5 years, whatever it was. It is a crazy number. He's right in that term. But don't make excuses. You've got to own your mistakes. Okay, your mistake this year might have been, you know what? I shouldn't have played. I was being too proud, and I wasn't healthy, and I really should have said that, and I really hurt the team. But he wouldn't say that, And that's kind of the issue with him, is that not only he doing all this stuff, but the Browns throwing on we want an adult in our quarterback room. Oh, and then you're going to go trade for a guy with 23 civil cases? That makes a lot of sense. But it's more of the fact that they threw a lot of crap on him. He wouldn't take responsibility. Now nobody wants to pay him $18 million because is he going to destroy our locker room? And so I think if he could have been moved, he'd be gone already. But they haven't found. They're still trying to figure out if there's a way they can get rid of him without paying them $18 million. Brissett is definitely a guy that's brought in because you know you're probably not going to have Watson for 6 to 8 games next year, realistically. I think 8 games is probably a realistic suspension to consider, because if you look at Ezekiel Elliott a few years ago, and he was proven innocent in his situation where he was his ex-girlfriend or somebody, I think it was his second or third year, they accused him of assaulting her in a parking lot. And it was a crazy, wild story that didn't make a lot of sense, but they still suspended him 6 games, even after he'd proved his innocence. So I think 8 games, considering the multitude of what this is probably where the NFL is going to settle on. So you're expecting Brissett to play 8 games essentially.
Yeah, definitely. And now just moving on to one that is a little bit more personal for me. You have the Robert Woods trade from to Rams to Tennessee. This one was definitely one of those cap hit moves. Obviously, Robert Woods was paid a contract a couple seasons ago. They extended him and Cooper Kupp around the same time, if I'm not mistaken. And you just look at how those two are similar in the way that they play. They're kind of run after the catch, because more possession guys. Mm-hmm. This was a move not only to free up cap space to then go and sign Bobby Wagner, but it was also a move to make space, for Allen Robinson and some of the other young wide receivers they have on their depth chart. I think that he's a pretty good fit in Tennessee. Obviously now Tennessee is without A.J. Brown, but they weren't at the time. So I thought, he would be a pretty good wide receiver too. I'm not so sure about him being a wide receiver 1 coming off that ACL injury. But I think that overall, just for similar to what Amari Cooper went for, I think that was a good trade for the Rams. You trade Robert Woods, you get cap space for Bobby Wagner, you create some space for Allen Robinson. I'm taking that all day. But in terms of locker room, I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. AJ Brown, in that trade, I don't know if we're going to get into that one. That's a draft day trade. AJ Brown wanted out of Tennessee. And that's kind of been a thing that's been ongoing for a while. And it's really because Tennessee didn't want to pay him. They're paying a ton of money right now to Ryan Tannehill. I think that's a contract they want to get out of next year. But there's a lot of guys on this roster right now that they want to keep around for a while. AJ was one of them. I don't think he wanted to be in Tennessee. I think he just kind of felt like we're going to be a mid-tier team for a while, and he wanted to go off somewhere else, so they moved him to Philadelphia, which, whatever. I'm not entirely sure what his ambition was, but what I do know is that Robert Woods is a needed person in that locker room right now for Tennessee, because let's say that they don't trade for Robert Woods and they move AJ Brown because he doesn't want to be there. You're about to roll out a receiver group that looks like Racey McMath, Nick Westbrook-Akeen. They're not terrible guys. They're just inexperienced, and they still made some mistakes. Westbrook-Akeen dropped that ball late in the fourth quarter against Cincinnati, deflected up in the air, got picked to set up the game-winning field goal for the Bengals to move on past them. So that's concerning. Dez Fitzpatrick is a guy that they really like too, and I really like Dez Fitzpatrick, but these are guys that aren't quite ready to step in and be starters right now. And so you needed a guy to kind of offset some of that stuff. And Robert Woods helps that tremendously. So I like that for Tennessee. They're going to try to probably use him a lot like they used A.J. Brown, because he was so effective in those 15-yard ins specifically in crossing routes. That's what Tannehill really likes to throw. And Woods will be really good right there too, assuming he stays healthy, of course.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that they also try to do right by him, working with him to find a good landing spot. I think that both sides agreed on a really good deal.
Yeah, 100%.
Moving on to the other side of that Carson Wentz deal, you have his replacement coming into Indianapolis from Atlanta, Matt Ryan. I think that was a great deal for Indy. I mean, you get a quarterback that has also been one of those questions similar to Matt Stafford, like what what's been going on in Atlanta for the past couple of years. They just haven't been able to put together with him, but he hasn't been, the 100% thing that's been wrong with the team. What do you think about him in Indy now?
The biggest thing about the Matt Ryan trade is that the way Matt Ryan's contract was written with the Falcons, they're paying him this year. So the Colts essentially have Matt Ryan for free. It's like a $42 million cap hit on the Falcons, and he's not even playing for them. So I don't know what the Falcons are doing. I'm not going to pretend to know what the Falcons are doing. But that is for the Colts, that's a no-brainer. You mean to tell me that we get to move a guy that we don't want in our locker room, and the guy that we're going to replace him is somebody else is paying for him? Are you kidding me? Like, that's a no-brainer. And it's not like they can't have success either, because a couple of years ago they brought in Phillip Rivers, right, from the Chargers, and that worked out really well for them. Unfortunately, they just didn't have a great team to make a good playoff run, and it all kind of fell apart there in the wild card. But you made the playoffs. Matt Ryan's not quite at the point of his career right now where Phillip Rivers was a couple years ago. Ryan's got a couple really good years left in him. He's not looking to retire in the next year or two, So you've got a guy that you can probably play for 2-3 years, and then next year, if you really want, draft his successor. Because I don't think you're looking at Sam Ehlinger right now going, oh yeah, we want that guy to be our starting quarterback in 3 years from now. Ehlinger's going to be a really good backup for a long time. But it was a great deal for the Colts. They got a steal out of it. I mean, you get another team to pay for your quarterback, and it's at $42 million. That's awesome.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it was a good trade on both, not necessarily on both sides, but the Falcons were able to get a little bit of compensation back for their franchise quarterback. But I think that overall, Indy, he's probably one of the better QBs they've had in recent years. You look at Jacoby Brissett, Carson Wentz. I would say Matt Ryan is the best out of those group. And I think that if he can carry them
because
to
of
the
where
playoffs,
Rivers was at the point where Rivers was in his career, yeah, he would be the best for sure.
Yeah, I think that if he can carry them, even into the second round of the playoffs, that'll be a win for them. Mm-hmm. And just the fact that this is probably one of the better teams he's been on in recent years just excites me, I think, to see him go tear it up in Indy.
One of the best, no, I think it's hands down. This is the best team he's been on since the 2016 Falcons. 100%, no doubt.
Yeah. And then going on to the next trade, we have the Tyreek Hill trade. When this news broke, I was like, wow, I guess anyone's just on the market. No one is free from being traded. What do you think about Tyreek Hill?
So I'm not trying to play spoiler or anything here, but I kind of heard that there was some talks going on about this when I was at the Combine. So it didn't shock me. But it's another one of those situations where it's a receiver wanting to get paid. So that's kind of a topic that would be great to do a podcast episode on sometime, is like the wide receiver market. Is it going to stay like this where top tier receivers are getting $28 million a year, or is this about to drop? Because I think this is really about to drop. And so that's why you're seeing all these receivers move this year, because teams are realizing that this is a spike. This is like a last hurrah for wide receivers in terms of getting paid. The running backs saw this a few years ago when like Zeke and a few of those other receivers got those massive contracts. It was a last hurrah of running backs getting that big giant contract, and it's going to come right. It's going to spike right back down like Wall Street. It's going to look like that. It's going to go straight back down. And your top tier receivers are going to be getting $20 million a year at tops, even as the salary cap continues to rise. So that's why the Chiefs moved on from Hill, because there's half of the NFL teams that believe the wide receiver market is going to crash and they're not going to be stuck with a massive contract. The other half of teams are like, well, we'll go ahead and pay the money now and use these guys to try to boost our teams. And so for Hill, this team is so loaded with speed right now, it's not even funny. If Jalen Waddle had been healthy enough to run a 40-yard dash, that dude's probably would have run a 4.3, and it might have been a 4.3 flat. Tyreek's a 4.2 guy. They added that running back, Raheem Mostert, from San Francisco, who's a 4.3 guy. So the biggest question mark is on Tua Tagovailoa right now. Do you have the arm strength? to push the ball down the field to these guys because they're going to be open. You just got to throw it to them. You got to hit them in stride. And that's what the biggest question mark is. And that's what we
Yeah,
get to find out this
definitely.
year.
I think we all saw that video, on social media from the Dolphins team that, he almost underthrew Tyreek a little bit, and that raised a bunch of
It's
questions for
it's
sure.
practice. It's practice. They're getting familiar with, dude. If you got a guy as fast as Tyreek Hill and you're out there throwing to him for the first time, there's no way you're hitting him in stride. There's no way, because you're going to underthrow him every time because you're like, oh, I can't believe this guy's that fast. I'm trying to think of who it was that said that about a guy and who it was. I can't remember, man. It was a few years ago. There was a real fast receiver that got moved on the market, and the quarterback was literally, I can't remember what team it was or anything, but they were sitting there like, I kept underthrowing him because I couldn't believe he was that fast. Like it's an adjustment that you have to make when you have a guy with electric speed that you haven't had in previous years, and finding that spot where you get to throw it. Whether it's a feel, whether it's a timing type thing, they're going to get it. They'll get it figured out. And if they don't, it's going to be because Tua doesn't have the arm, but they're going to get it figured out.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like you said, the biggest question mark is just on Tua. I mean, he's got the team around him now. You got a really stacked running back room with some of the additions this past offseason.
Mm-hmm.
Myles Gaskin obviously was there already, but you have add Sony Michel, you had Raheem Mostert, you had Chase Edmonds, all who haven't really, been the lead back and sit in their situations, but they've been good rotational backs. They're going to run a pretty similar system to San Francisco, I would assume. Just the fact that they have depth at the running back position.
Most importantly, Teron Armstead. Cannot go without mentioning Teron Armstead. That is arguably one of the top 5. I don't think it's arguably. It's hands down top 5 left tackle in the NFL right now.
Yeah, I was really surprised the Saints let him walk. I know you're trying to build a team around that offensive line for Miami, and just the fact that they're going to be running a similar offense to San Francisco just goes to show you what investment they had to make in their line.
Yeah, there's no way the Saints could do it though. I mean, he was going to go. He took, it was what, 24 million a year Armstead took with the Dolphins. I don't remember that number off the top of my head, unfortunately. The Saints came into the year, I want to say it was $79 million over the cap. So they had to work their cap magic to get back under it and then free up some space. There was no way they were going to be able to keep Armstead there with those kind of cap issues. No way.
Yeah. And then moving into our last trade, we're going to do one draft day trade. That's all we could get to today. We have Arizona trading for Marquise Brown. Like you said already, we have that familiarity. His college quarterback was obviously Kyler Murray, and they're going to be without DeAndre Hopkins, which probably prompted them to do this trade. For the first 6 games, you're going to be without your main wide receiver. Marquise Brown hasn't been, the best in Baltimore. He's also not paired with, a very good throwing QB in Lamar. What do you think about him in this new situation?
So, first off, I think I had a really good conversation about this where we talked about it from a lot of different angles with Michael Telford a couple episodes ago on my show. So I got some really good insight. Chibs, he knows a bunch of people inside the Ravens. He's very familiar with everything that they want to do. He watches every game religiously. I think the Ravens, he is a heathen, so the Ravens are his religion. This trade was really, like you said, it was prompted by DeAndre Hopkins in the upcoming suspension, right? And you needed to also replace the production that you lost losing Christian Kirk to the Jacksonville Jaguars. Because of that move, you there's 112 targets that you're replacing this year, and I think that's about where Marquise Brown was last year. You've got a guy that can play out of the slot. He can be the Z as well. So you're probably going to have to slide AJ Green out to the boundary. You're going to put Brown in at the 2. You're going to run Rondale out of the slot while D-Hop is suspended. And then after that, you'll move Brown probably down into the slot, or maybe even leave him there at the Z and put, AJ Green to a rotational role. Um, Made sense. You know, that it's all about production, replacing that production, and you're at that point with I think there were 6 wide receivers off the board by the time the Cardinals pick rolled around. They didn't feel comfortable taking a guy and getting that production back, and so why not take that pick and move it for a veteran guy that has been he has his drop issues. Everybody, he's dropped a lot of footballs over the last few years, but he's been targeted a lot. He's liked by his teammates, and it's a guy that you can kind of use with some, potentially groundbreaking speed, and pair that up with Rondale Moore. So made sense. Whether it pans out or not, whether he can overcome all those drop issues that he's had his entire career, we'll see.
Yeah. And just to wrap everything up, some of these trades, were prompted by cap space. Obviously the Rams motto is just F them picks. Obviously that's not going to work for every single team. And you just see people saying, the cap space is a myth. Obviously it's not, because you see deals like the Tyreek Hill trade. You see, AJ Brown, where they just didn't want to pay these receivers because of cap space. Do you think there's going to be more trades next offseason, in a similar fashion? Or are we going to see this trend stop after this offseason?
I don't think it's going to be as crazy. I obviously there's no way to sit here and say, oh yeah, I'm absolutely in touch with the future. I'll just jump in my time machine and check it out and tell you what happens. But I think the part of the reason why you saw this insanity this year is because the quarterback class and the top tier talent in the draft were down. And, so like everybody knew in the first 15 picks, it wasn't a lot of top tier talent. And you didn't have any quarterbacks in there that you really felt comfortable coming in week 1 and starting. So it forced teams to kind of get into, addressing their needs through veterans because they didn't feel comfortable with a lot of the guys coming in with the rookie class. The other thing too that we've never seen is the salary cap dropped in 2021, right? And then jumped back up in 2022. And so you had a lot of teams in 2021 that made a lot of cuts for the salary cap and made moves and moved people around based on that, and then tried to set up the contracts so that they would hit, big incentives in 20, and they'd have big raises in 2022. And some of those guys didn't work out. So now they're trying to get rid of them too, right? So a lot of this insanity was caused because of the salary cap drop in 2021, and it was teams adjusting for that and the lack of the top tier talent in the draft and no quarterbacks. So no, I don't think it's going to be something that we'll continue to see. It was definitely fun. It'll probably go down in history as the craziest offseason ever in the NFL, and it'll be the closest the NFL will ever be to the NBA. So
yeah, I totally agree. And also, you think they will probably influenced a little bit by the Rams, and you see them trading for some of these guys, and that just makes teams go, "Oh, we can do that." I mean,
yeah, to an extent. Not every team's going to sit there and say, "Yeah, we can." We're in a position where we can do that. So there were other teams. If you take the Eagles, I think the Saints probably could be considered there too. The Giants, the Jets, these teams that had multiple first-round picks this year, and so that was them capitalizing on some of those teams thinking, yeah, we're going to do the Rams thing and we're going to try to go get the stars and trade for them rather than try to develop somebody the long route. It's a cycle that happens every year in the NFL. Every single year you watch somebody win the Super Bowl for some reason, and it's this ingenious thing that nobody else ever thought of. For example, Eagles go win the Super Bowl in 2017. And the real reason for that was because they were running a rotational defensive front. And they had 8, 9 guys they would swap in and out the entire game, keep the defensive line fresh. Now, hell, I think 20 of the 32 teams do that consistently, right? So you can go through the years and you'll see a specific reason that's attributed to why this team was successful and why they won the Super Bowl. And teams try to go copy that, right? They wanted speed guys like Tyreek Hill because the Chiefs won a Super Bowl, right? People started to value veteran quarterbacks. Carson Wentz gets that trade to the Colts because Tom Brady just won a Super Bowl. Granted, it's Tom Brady, But if you got a veteran quarterback and you got a good enough roster around him, the veteran quarterback can lead that, right? Well, Carson Wentz wasn't that. So the Colts were like, yeah, that's not going to work. Everybody tries to, it's a copycat league. Everybody tries to copy each other. So there were definitely teams that were influenced by the idea that the Rams trade their top picks to go get stars and tried to go do that. But all that being said, it's a continuous thing that you're going to see every year where people try to do different things because it's worked for somebody else.
And that is just about going to do us for today. John, thank you for coming on. And you can go ahead and plug your stuff. Where can people find your work?
Yeah, so my podcast is the JDV Experience, offbeat football brand topics that you don't really hear anybody anywhere else. So that's on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, favorite podcast platforms, probably there. Footballsapient.com, obviously, where you and I work, and we do a lot of good stuff over there. And then you can follow me on Twitter at DraftVogel.
All right. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
To be updated every time a new episode drops, you can follow me at Football by Nico on Twitter. Thank you very much for listening to the pod.